Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a 9-part series about the post-World War II world. This is the second of 3 videos where I'm going to talk specifically about the Cold War. And in this video, the focus will be on steps taken by the United States to try to contain or halt the spread of communism. Let's get started. So with that, we'll begin first with a reality that took shape really just as soon as the war was done, one that we were really hopeful wouldn't happen, and that was that the Soviet Union did end up being a presence in Eastern European countries, despite what had been discussed at Yalta. And when you look at the countries on the map there, you can see East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. On the map picture there, they're shaded in kind of the lighter red or the pinker color. And you can see that basically those countries formed a line in between where the Soviet Union was and where the rest of Europe was located. Now, Stalin would argue that there was a history of invasions by Western European countries into Russia, and as a result, for their security's sake, it made sense for them to maintain a presence and have a friendly relationship with those Eastern European countries. And of course, if you're objective, there's truth in that. Obviously, Germany invaded the Soviet Union there during World War II. France invaded Russia about a century before that. So there was a record of that. However, it was frustrating from the perspective of the United States that this was the very thing that Stalin agreed not to do just really the year before. And sure enough, he's gone against that right away. And so one of the big questions that came up, especially for the United States, was what, if anything, to do about a situation like this, where something has happened that wasn't supposed to happen? Do you ignore it? Do you rationalize it as not being a big deal? Do you address it? And if we look back to the years leading into World War II, one of the things we know is that the common reaction to things not going the way they were supposed to was to try to either ignore or rationalize why it wasn't that big of a deal. And so one of the big questions at this point in time was, would the same course be followed by countries, or would a different course be followed? And one of the things we learn with Truman as president of the United States at this point is that he was not going to go the appeasement route, that he was going to call things out for what they were. And so when Stalin and the Soviet Union maintained a presence in those Eastern European countries, he was not shy about pointing out that this was in violation to what had been talked about at Yalta, and that was not okay. Now, one of the problems that you can run into when you confront someone on having done something they're not supposed to do is that creates the potential for conflict. I mean, that's the whole idea of appeasement, is giving in to avoid conflict. But when you do confront, it does create that potential for some kind of confrontation to happen. And though war didn't happen by Truman pointing out that this was in violation of Yalta, one of the things Stalin would say as early as 1946, so just in that first year after the war was over, is that he believed war between the United States and the Soviet Union was a certainty. So that was a little unnerving for people who were paying attention, because World War II was not even a year from being done, and we have the leader of one of the two world's superpowers saying, yes, war between our country and the other superpower is going to happen. So no one could know for sure what the future was going to hold. Now, with this occupation of these Eastern European countries by the Soviet Union and maintaining a presence there, a phrase ends up being coined at the time out of Great Britain. This reference to the Iron Curtain was something that Winston Churchill said, basically a reference to a divided Europe that now existed. That basically on one side of the divide, on the western side of the divide, you had predominantly democratic, somewhat capitalist Western European countries, and on the eastern side of that divide, you had communist countries. And that didn't necessarily mean one thing was absolutely right or another thing was absolutely wrong, but there was definitely a divide. There was definitely a difference on one side compared to the other. And one of the places where this would be most evident, especially moving forward, would be the city of Berlin and the country of Germany. Germany would ultimately end up being divided into two parts. It was not necessarily the intention that Germany would be divided eventually into an East Germany and a West Germany, but that's what would take place. and the capital city for Germany would end up being divided as well. And so, especially if you wanted to take a look at Europe and be able to literally see the differences between East and West, Berlin was the place to do it. Because what would happen in the years after World War II is Western countries that had a lot of resources would provide a lot of funding and support for West Germany and the western part of Berlin. And so, just in that city of Berlin, West Berlin rebuilt after the war, really modernized. But the eastern side, supported largely by the Soviet Union, didn't have a lot of resources for that. And so East Berlin basically remained to a large degree in rubble and ruins in the years after the war. And so quite literally from one side of the street to the other, you could see pretty vast differences in just what was available. And that will become an issue that we'll address at a later point as we talk about the Cold War years. Now, because Truman was pretty insistent on things working the way they were supposed to work, this would mark the beginning of what would become to be known as the U.S. containment policy. Basically, what our country decided to do was take steps to prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union and the expansion of Soviet influence around the world. And the way we were going to do this, and if you look closely at the picture on the screen, you can see that the person's hammering dollar signs into the ground. Basically, we were going to use the resources that we had available to us to try to help countries that we thought might be in a position of weakness relative to the Soviet Union and would be likely to partner with them. Because we wanted countries, if they were going to partner with anybody, to partner with us and conduct themselves in a way consistent with how we did things, because we felt like we did things in a way that was better for people than what was true with the Soviet Union. And so we began as early as 1946 and 1947, so just the first year or two after World War II was over, establishing some policies and setting up some programs to provide assistance to different countries around the world. Now, the first places to receive some assistance were the countries of Turkey and Greece, and this ends up becoming a part of what was known as the Truman Doctrine, which was just a general principle that we would support countries who would reject communism. And this was not necessarily something everybody thought was a good idea, because it's important to remember that throughout American history, we mostly positioned ourselves as an isolated country, one that pretty much took care of ourselves and stayed out of the affairs of other countries. We obviously got pulled into things with World War I, but then we went back to isolation. We got pulled into things again with World War II, but now we were going to take a different approach. We were going to actually be actively involved with what was going on with other countries around the world. And so Congress voted to provide aid to the countries of Turkey and Greece. Geographically, those are countries that were in close proximity to both the Soviet Union as well as the Eastern European countries that the Soviet Union was an influence in. It seemed logical that they would be countries that the Soviets would like to partner with. And our hope was that if we provided them with some aid and assistance to the tune of $400 million worth of aid, that they would be partners with us. And that would prove to be true. So if you want to measure success or not with aid to those two countries, they remained partners and friendly with the United States moving forward during the Cold War years. So if that was the objective, things worked out. Now, with the overall success or seeming success of giving aid to Turkey and Greece, this would evolve into a bigger plan that would end up involving more countries, something that overall was known as the Marshall Plan. And basically the idea with the Marshall Plan was to give aid to any European country that needed it. And so, again, Congress would work to authorize money for different countries, and that's exactly what we would do. Now, the name simply came from the person who ultimately proposed the plan, which was then Secretary of State George Marshall. And the whole idea was that whatever countries needed, that's what we would try to provide for them. So if that was food, we would try to provide food. If it was like farm machinery, if it was actual money, we basically tried to provide what they needed. Now, part of the expectation was that they would not only be friendly with the United States and be a partner with us, but would also be a consumer or a buyer of American products. So this wasn't a purely altruistic endeavor where we were just trying to be nice and using the resources. I mean, we had goals beyond that, and so there was a lot to the program. Now, As far as money provided by our government to these various countries, we provided aid to the tune of about $12.5 billion, which was a lot of money, still a lot of money. And overall, it was deemed a successful program. Because if you look at countries that received aid, if you look at the chart on the picture right now, you can see with the stacks of dollar signs to represent how much aid countries got. You can see that a lot of countries throughout Europe received aid. I mean, if you look at that, Iceland, Ireland, Great Britain, France, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Austria, West Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, lots and lots of different countries received aid and would be purchasers of American goods, as well as being general partners with the United States. So this is kind of where we were at in those early years after the war was done. The Soviet Union took some steps to do some things that we didn't think were quite right, and our at least initial steps to try to counter what the Soviets were doing was to try to provide help to countries we thought the Soviets might try to get on their side. Well, hopefully that video was helpful at showing the effort that the United States put into trying to promote America's vision for the world, and in particular to halt the spread of communism. Thanks for watching.